Hey everybody, it's 4 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. First of all, the standard 2 announcements. 1 is please turn off your cell phones and other noise-making, distracting telephony devices. And 2 is please fill out your evaluation forms. I know you've heard this a million times, but the CMP Media Group really does take those into account. Every single thing you write down will eventually get back to me, and I will read your comments and take them seriously, so please do that. Secondly, just before I get started, my name is Randy, and I'm going to talk about level building for stealth gameplay. So just as a show of hands, who here is either currently working on or predicts that in the near future they may be working on a game with stealth elements in it? Anybody? That's kind of more than I thought. Go relevancy scores. All right. And of those people who just raised their hand, who's working on like a level building capacity on those games? Anybody? Okay, not too bad. This is kind of a niche talk, so it's nice to see that there's some good relevance going on. Okay, so really quickly, who am I? I'm Randy. I've worked on the Thief series of games at a couple different companies, and since then I've been a freelance designer. I've worked on a couple projects that also have significant stealth gameplay, including the game Might of Magic: Dark Messiah, which is in production by Arcane Studios, and over at the Ubisoft Montreal studio, there's a game called Open Season, which also has stealth. So I've worked on a bunch of stealth stuff for about 8 years now. I started off as a level builder and also as a designer, and over time I grew into more of a leader, project director type position. So the message here is I've been involved in the level building process of stealth games in various capacities. I wanted to refine the topic a little bit really quickly. So the kind of thing I am going to be talking about is the moment-to-moment, on the ground, sneaking around gameplay part of your level. And I'm not so much going to be talking about the story of your level. Hey, what are you here to sneak around? Why are you bothering? The objectives part. What are good objectives for stealth levels? Where do you put the exciting twist where you change the objectives on the player and they have to reconfigure their goals? I'm not going to be talking about level editors or the tools that we as the electronic tools that we as level builders use to make our levels, like Max or Maya or whatever. I'm not going to be talking about the game systems, although this is clearly extremely relevant for stealth games, and it's really relevant for level building outside of the scope of this talk to an extent, but we will get into it a little bit. I'm not going to be talking about process, how to schedule your levels, how to prototype them. So talking about moment-to-moment gameplay. Specifically, the sneaking around undetected part of stealth gameplay. There's other parts of stealth like backstabbing guys and twisting their necks off and so on. And those are great parts, but we're not going to discuss them. So when I say stealth games, what I mean, the top line here is games that focus primarily on stealth. Those are kind of clear candidates for that question. The second line is those are games that, while not primarily about stealth, do have some sort of stealth elements to them. But there's some other ones that don't leap out right away. There's sniper games, like when you're, or maybe there's a shooter where you have a sniper rifle or something, and those are kind of stealth games because you're, killing somebody from far away and they don't know you're there. Or submarine games are actually kind of stealth games, right? Because you're one vessel who's trying to sneak up on another vessel and without being detected. Although we won't actually get into the submarine games domain all that much because level building is not the most exciting problem. So when I say stealth games, I'm talking about any game that emphasizes a model of the player hiding and being discovered in some capacity or other. So there's a couple reasons why it's kind of hard to give this talk. And I mean hard in the sense of I might accidentally make assumptions that don't apply to your game. And there's 2 big ones. And one of the big ones is that when you build levels, you're building content, and the content has to be a good match for the game systems. These 2 things, as you see, form one whole when put together perfectly. And so when you're building content, you're really trying to match your game systems. The way I like to think about this is game systems are toys. They're things like springs and foam swords and pogo sticks and whatever. And, the players get to play with them. And as a level builder, what you're doing is you're building a playground in which the players can have some sort of fun experience with the toys. And since I don't know the specifics of the stealth game you may or may not be working on, I don't know which toys you have available to you. And so therefore, how can I tell you what playground you should build? And as a concrete example of this is my first top-down diagram of stunning beauty. So this is a top-down diagram. The idea is the player has to get from the bottom of the screen to the top by sneaking. There's a guard who's on a patrol path back and forth, and those lights, which I call torches, they could be anything. Cast this light, which overlaps, whatever. So one game mechanical question for your game might be, hey, can you extinguish lights? And sort of my claim here is, if you can't extinguish lights, this is a fine game because, you put out one or the other of the torches, and then when the guard's on the other side of his patrol path, the player can sneak around in the dark spot and then may be on his way. But if you can't, this is a bad level, piece to your level, because there's no good solution to get through here. Another reason that's pretty hard to give a talk like this in terms of making incorrect assumptions is that the other thing that content does is it supports an aesthetic vision for your game. So when I talk about the aesthetic vision for your game, I'm saying like what sort of play experience are you trying to create for the player. This is more than genre or fiction, like is it a space game, is it a dungeon crawling game, whatever. But those things clearly do impact the player's experience. What I'm really talking about is like how does it feel to play the game? What is the aesthetic of the interaction itself? And so I'm going to give you a couple examples to point this out. These sort of both assume the same exact game mechanics, but we're going to see two different aesthetics. So in this one, the idea is there's these shadowy alcoves that the player can hide in, and there's a guard patrolling down this hallway. And so the player kind of sneaks into one alcove, waits for the guard to go by and patrol, sneaks into the next alcove, and so on. And it kind of has this feeling of being like a slow, thoughtful game where you wait and watch the guy go by, and then you sneak up to the next one and wait and watch the guy go by. And there's kind of a lot of waiting and hanging out and thinking and planning. Using the same game mechanics, you could make a very different piece to this level where, it's kind of the same thing, except for when the player goes to hide in this one corner in the bottom left, the guard's patrol path will actually take him into that corner. It's not as, safe an environment as the little alcove where the guards never come. So as soon as the player gets there, suddenly they can see the next part of the level they haven't seen before, but the guard is coming and he's going to flush them out of this corner, and so they have to hurry up and get to the next little alcove, thinking on your feet, so it's a little bit of faster pace. So aesthetics, the way I like to think about aesthetics is with the MDA framework, which is pioneered by Mark LeBlanc and Robin Hunicke, among other people. And I don't have time to get into it in very much depth, but the basic idea here is anything you want to talk about a game's design can be put into one of three categories which have this causal relationship. And the three categories are mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, hence MDA. Mechanics are, really quickly the static rules of the game, like the things that don't change. You can kind of think of it as the information on the disk of the video game when you hand it to the player. That's the rules of the game. Dynamics are what happens at runtime, like the system of the game, including the player, like when the game is being played, what behaviors do you see occurring dynamically? And the aesthetics is the emotional experience that the player has in response to those dynamics. So in the example I just gave here, the mechanics, there's tons of mechanics that I'm not mentioning, but kind of the relevant ones are staggered alcoves and patrol paths set up in that particular way. So that's the mechanics that you as a level builder put into the level, which then leads to that dynamic we saw, the carefully timed moving and waiting, and that's the thing that has the aesthetic of slow and thoughtful pacing. So the relevant point here is, like, as a designer, you only have control over mechanics. Like, you're not there to tell the player what to do when the game is running. And you can't just tell them what kind of experience they're having. So you create these mechanics, and there's this very indirect relationship over the aesthetics. And this again brings us back to the fact that you need an aesthetic goal. You're building mechanics. What are you trying to achieve? So I'm going to get around those two problems by making some assumptions. Stealth games have lots of different game systems, lots of different mechanics, depending on which stealth game it is. But there's some elements that are common to lots of stealth games, and I'm going to be reusing those pretty commonly. And this one's a little bit more important a point, I think. I sort of work to define, like, what is the most common aesthetic goal for a stealth game or a level of a stealth game. And so this is what I came up with. I'm just going to read it. Create the illusion of a securely guarded area that the player can sneak through by virtue of leveraging their unique abilities and tools to create and exploit security flaws. And we're going to come back to this statement. One of the ideas about making an aesthetic vision statement like this is you can test it. So here are my criteria for both success and failure. So after you've built your level, you can, or when you're designing your level and thinking about how it's going to play out, you can go test to see if these things are true. So you'll know your level is successful if the player feels powerful by virtue of their stealthy behavior. If the player feels like someone who is behaving less stealthily than them, maybe including themselves if they were being less stealthy, would get caught. That they are, in fact, creating and exploiting security flaws in some way. Those are good success criteria. Failure would be stuff like, hey, stealth isn't necessary because really this area isn't all that well guarded. This isn't a secure area. I can sneak through this, no problem. Or maybe, hey, it's a little bit more fun to just kill everybody or just run through really quickly. Or if it's too hard, like it really is really secure and you get caught a lot. So the first big topic I want to talk to is the low threshold for failure. We're going to come back to this diagram. So the aesthetic goal said that we are going to create the illusion of a securely guarded area that the player can sneak through. So if it's securely guarded, why can the player sneak through it? So it's kind of your goal is to make the player feel like they're so special that they can do this impossible thing. But the players aren't special. There's like millions of players, and a million people can't all be special. That kind of undermines the definition of the word special. So you've got to make them feel like they are. So this is pretty hard in stealth games, and the reason is because of this idea it's called the threshold for failure. In a combat game, what you're trying to do is avoid getting damaged. Like there's no failure whatsoever if you haven't been shot at all. And if you get shot and you eventually die, that's like full failure. And in between there's this big margin of what I like to call partial failure, which is essentially about as big as the player has hit points. Like you're getting damaged, but you're still allowed to play the game. You haven't failed yet. You can in a lot of combat games, you can get shot to ridiculous amounts and still play. In stealth games, this isn't true. When you're most of the time when you're actually playing the game as a stealthy player, you're well in the completely no failure zone. And as soon as you sort of hit that margin of the partial failure margin, it tends to go really quickly into full failure. And a lot of this is because of the aesthetic, goals we talked about. Like we want the player to feel like they really are being sneaky, and that that's kind of hard to sneak around this place. And if you have a guard who kind of starts to see you, but then for some reason it sort of doesn't, players don't buy it, and you're not going to hit that aesthetic. And like a particular example I can think of is in Zelda Wind Waker, which I confess I didn't finish, but I got pretty far. And there's kind of a milestone stealth level right in the beginning where you're hiding in this bucket and there's guards on patrols and you have to sort of drop down or whatever. If the guards start to see you, they play this one animation, and if they finish the animation and you're still moving, you're caught. And I think the margin for failure is 0.7 seconds or something it's super tiny. Other games like Thief, the margin for failure is a little bit bigger. It's when they start searching for you, you're in the partial failure margin, so it's expanded, but it's still pretty small. It's kind of like if it was a stealth or a combat game and you had 2 hit points. It's very small margin for failure. So what does that mean in terms of us being level builders and trying to build good stealth levels? Well, in a combat game, it's a perfectly valid thing to do to build this room where all players are going to fail a little bit. It's oh man, there's 8 monsters and they all have rocket launchers and going to shoot the crap out of you. And all the players who come here, they're going to come into full hit points and armor, and then when on the way out, they're going to have half or less. That can totally be a valid decision for you as a level builder in a combat game, because the next room you can just throw in some health packs or whatever. In a stealth game, you really can't do that, because as soon as players start to fail, they're going to fail all the way. So you have to do this balancing act. You have to give them a means to experience little or no failure in every single encounter. And I like to call this zero failure, just for clarity. So you have to provide this means for the player to experience zero failure, and on top of that, you have to communicate it, because if you're not telling the player how to get through, the experience without failing and being caught, then they're going to have to do it by trial and error inherently involves failure. So that's not going to work either. And unfortunately, you also can't be too obvious about it, because if you're obvious about it, suddenly it doesn't look like a stealthy area anymore. If there's, the blazing trail of here's where you should, here's the air duct or whatever, that doesn't feel like a stealthy area. So again, it's a balancing act. If you give them too much help, they're going to feel like they don't have to be stealthy. If you don't give them enough help, they're going to feel like they're incapable and they get caught too often. So the question is, what are these things on the scales? These are the things on the scales. We're going to get back to them. But I like to call them, the specifics that is, but I like to call them challenges and advantages. So that's from a player point of view, the challenges for the players of trying to be stealthy, or the advantages that help them be stealthy. And that brings me to my second big topic, which is design tools. All these things that I already mentioned are design tools. So when I talk about design tools, I'm not talking about the players' tools, like their radar jammers, their ability to hide in shadows, or move silently, or their lockpicks, or whatever other stealthy tools they might have. I'm not talking about the tools we use to build levels, level editors, whatever. But these are abstract tools that we as designers can use to tune our levels and so on. Excuse me. So the two I'm going to talk about most are mechanics that you can add to a level that help manage the player's experience. So we just saw shadowy alcoves using those examples, as design tools. They're also dynamics in this MDA framework again, behaviors that occur at runtime that you as a designer understand and therefore can predict how the player is going to behave in your level, or predict some other aspect of the level's performance and behavior. So the fact that players are drawn into shadowy alcoves is a dynamic design tool. Hey, when you place that shadowy alcove, you can predict something about the player's experience. So what do we use these for? Well, one is, we've sort of been talking about already, is you can manage the challenge level of your room or your stealth encounter or whatever. Do this balancing act. But you can do other stuff too. If you know how players are going to move through your level, then you can do a little bit of pacing control with that. And so essentially, another title for this lecture could be design tools that I like to use to overcome the unique challenges of building stealth levels / meet the unique goals of building stealth levels. specific kind of design tool, which is super crucial for stealth levels, is environmental tools. So let's talk about how to build a combat encounter. And again, we're going to assume like some kind of single-player or first-person shooter type game. So how do you build an awesome combat encounter? Well, obviously, you start with an empty room, and you throw in tons of enemies, and then you throw in some power-ups, and and this is it. This is great. This is a fantastic room because there's 3 guys, and then you can pick up some ammo and some armor, and you shoot everybody, and then they're dead, and you move on. And that's fantastic. But as we all know, that's an oversimplified view, and anybody who's created a really exquisite first-person shooter experience will tell you that it's really kind of about the level layout and the environment itself, right? Like, you got to think a lot about, hey, there's hard cover, and the player can kind of hide behind that, or take cover when somebody shoots at them, and you want to put up these balconies where they can like snipe people, and there's low walls, and they can duck behind them when they're having machine gun battles and stuff. I'm actually not that great of a first-person shooter level builder, so I'm making this up. And challenges include blind corners where if you like jump out, you're going to get shot, and tight passageways that restrict your movement, or like the low wall that you use for cover also could kind of be a block where you're trying to get to the next place, but you have to jump over, and it's kind of a pain in the ass. And these are environmental tools. That's what I'm talking about when I say environmental tools. And environmental tools are big in stealth, and they come in the 2 flavors of advantages and disadvantages. Darkness and light is kind of the most obvious examples. If there's darkness in the level and you've got the kind of game system where a player can hide in shadows, like in Thief, then that's an obvious advantage, versus light is a disadvantage or a challenge for the player. So let's take a look at how one uses environmental tools to balance an encounter. So now we've got this example of a guard on an L-shaped patrol path, and the player has to get through this room again, and he's got to get, there's a torch. That's your obstacle, part of the challenges of this room. And so here, that was 2 challenges, guard, torch, and I added 2 advantages, which is the spot in the bottom. These are shadows, by the way, of course. So that's a shadowy alcove in the top, and that's a shadowy kind of area towards the beginning of the room, which I'm going to call a scouting location. And there, I've balanced it, right? But clearly there's more going on. There's more that I did to that particular example to try to tune it. And in fact, the thing is that the balancing paradigm or whatever isn't really a great model. It's oversimplified. So we're going to get rid of that, and we're going to dig in a little deeper on this. So the way I want to start is like, hey, let's just imagine we're the player. We come into this room from the bottom, and we hide in this like scouting spot at the entrance to the room. And so what can we see, and how do we feel, and what's our plan? So, well, we feel a little safe, right? Because we know that where we are right now, even if somebody shows up, we're not going to get caught. We can kind of look, and we can see a torch, and we can see the shadowy alcove back there. Maybe we should go there. We can't really see around the corner of this L-shaped room. Oh, and then suddenly a guard walks out. We didn't see him before. Okay. So now we know there's a guard, and hey, he turns the corner, starts walking right towards us. Crap, is he coming towards me? Do I have to leave? Oh, he turned around, he's going back the other way. So the player what might the player do? The player might wait and to get a better idea where the guard's patrol is. And then at some point they're going to have to make their move. So probably what they're going to do is wait till the guard continues his patrol, takes the corner, and then they're going to go up, while his back is turned and make it to the shadowy alcove. Then when the guard goes by again, they're going to sneak their way out of the room. What is the effect of the guard's patrol? I think what I was talking about there was just like when he's the effect of his patrol. There's 2 effects. One is that part of the time he's out of sight, and so the player might not see him right away. And the other one is like, despite the fact that his patrol allows him to control more territory in the sense that there's more of this room he can see, his patrol also means that at any one time he can't see the whole room. So it kind of it's kind of more difficult. It's a challenge for the player, but at the same time it's kind of an advantage. So let's make some observations about that analysis I just did. So one is like, hey, what do we really mean when we're talking about advantages and challenges? Apparently I like the word disadvantage for challenges just as much because it's all over the place in the slides. Anyway, by advantage, it's really anything that's going to make it easier for the player to succeed at the stealth gameplay. And conversely, by challenge or disadvantage, it's anything that makes it easier for the player to fail. So it's kind of basic, but it's good to kind of get more clarity on our terms. And some things like that patrol path and the hardcover. By hardcover, I'm talking about the L-shaped room where you can't see the guy when he's around the corner. Those are kind of both advantages and challenges. And so there's a big part of this analysis that had to do with player psychology. Like, hey, what does it mean to be in this level, and what does it feel like, and what kind of plans are you going to make based on what you see? There's a lot of predicting how the player is going to behave. And one other thing I want to do during this lecture is catalog the different environmental tools and design tools that I use. So the couple that have come up so far are soft cover, such as darkness. It could be other things in your specific game systems. But any soft cover is any place where there's not a physical object around the player that's protecting the player, but for whatever reason, they're invisible when they stand in that spot. It could be a bush they hide in, it could be shadows they hide in, but it's like the location where they can't be seen. And hard cover is obviously like something that blocks lines of sight completely. The difference being that, if there's hard cover between you and your enemies, then you can't see them either. So the L-shaped room is a good hard cover example, and I think L-shaped rooms are almost always better than square rooms in stealth games. I'm going to introduce a new tool, which is loud surfaces. This was big in Thief and some other stealth games I've seen. The idea is basically like, this is the surface that if you walk over it, it's going to make noise and attract enemies' attention because they can hear you. There's a model of hearing. So the next point I want to make is that environmental tools are sneaky. So this is an example. There's like this big thing of loud flooring in the middle of the room, but the outside of the room is not loud, and the player can walk around on the outside. And there's a guard in here, and for some reason, let's say the guard can't see the player. Maybe it's kind of dark. Who knows? But there's some obstruction along the way. Maybe this is a barrel. Maybe this is a column that was put here for aesthetic or believability/realism reasons. Who knows? So obviously there's this problem where when the player gets up to that obstruction, they have to walk out onto the loud surface, and they're going to attract attention to the guard. So even though that column wasn't placed there specifically to have that impact on the player, it wasn't put there as a challenge, it still has that effect. And that's what I mean when I say environmental tools are sneaky, is that they impact the gameplay of the level even if they didn't intend to. This is huge in stealth games in terms of levels. Like, a lot of times when I get frustrated playing stealth games, it's because, including Thief, as a matter of fact, it's because you're just trying to get through, and then somebody had this thing that seemed like a good idea for whatever reason, and it screwed you up in some way or other. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more. So the most common offenders from Thief include doors, because, hey, you don't know what's on the other side of the door until you open it, and then once you open it, if there's something there, oh, well, that was a surprise and you're screwed. Staircases, because they limit your mobility in all three dimensions, and it's really hard to see on staircases typically, like what's coming up. So that's kind of similar to like tight corridors. Furniture is a big one because it's always there, it's always in your way, and you bump into it, and it makes noise, and then guards hear you. And tile flooring is a big one because in Thief we made the perhaps stupid game mechanical decision that if you walk across tile flooring, it makes a lot of noise and guards can hear you. It's like a very loud surface to walk on. But we also wanted to create these opulent levels that players would believe in the fantasy of stealing rich things, and so, hey, they'll just have a lot of tile flooring. So those are common offenders from Thief. So what's going on here? The problem is that you have this really over-constrained problem when you're building stealth levels. You have a lot of constraints that include, like, let's make this level beautiful. Let's make sure it runs at a high performance. Like, make sure it's not too dark on the monitor because, well, we screwed that one up in Thief a fair amount too. But, we want the players to be able to see what they're doing is a pretty good goal. So, like, for example, in Thief, we often had, like, these, because of the fiction, we had these, like, dungeons or abandoned places where it really didn't make a lot of sense that there would be lighting. Like, who walks through the haunted house and keeps ghosts do, of course. Okay, bad example, but in, some other abandoned place, who lights all the torches? So there weren't torches. But the problem is, like, that's this huge environmental advantage for the player. Like, it's trivial to sneak through a dark place. And that kind of makes the point that, like, when I talk about these challenges and advantages being tools, they're tools for you, like, from the player's point of view, like, they don't want the challenges and they do want the advantages. From the designer point of view, they're both equally valid. Like, you use them to control the experience. Again, you want it to be easy, but not too easy. I'm missing a slide, I think. Oh, no, I'm not. Okay. I'm going to introduce a new tool. We already saw soft cover and hard cover, but we have not seen blind corners yet. Blind corners are pretty similar to hard cover, with the exception that hard cover kind of works both ways. Like, they can't see you, you can't see them. Blind corners are a little bit more like doors, where, like, as soon as you come around the blind corner in a stealth game, that's it. Either you're exposed or you're not. You don't get a chance to think ahead about what might be there. And so in terms of performance constraints, in Unreal levels, we see a lot of these S-shaped curves because you need them to make sure that each room of the level doesn't render the room beyond it and slow the performance down too much. But those S-shaped curves have two blind corners in them. So this is another example of, like, you're just trying to build your level and meet your constraints, but you're also kind of accidentally throwing in these environmental tools. So what are you going to do about this? What's the solution to that? The biggest solution is, like, just acknowledge the fact that when you build levels, you're creating gameplay relevance, potentially creating gameplay relevance every time you add something to them, even if that wasn't what you're trying to do with that. And a big metric I want to talk about is stealth-friendly versus stealth-unfriendly. So stealth-friendly versus stealth-unfriendly is, this metric that we developed while working on the Thief games, which refers only to the environment. So when you talk about this metric, you're not talking about the enemies. You just kind of take them out of the equation temporarily. It's kind of simple. Stealth-friendly means that there's way more environmental challenges advantages than challenges, and conversely, stealth-unfriendly means that there's way more environmental challenges than advantages. So we've already kind of been talking about the macro, meaning entire encounter application of this concept. Like on a whole, room basis, the room can either be sort of stealth-friendly or stealth-unfriendly, depending on what the quantity of challenges is in that room. If it's, so what do you do? If it's stealth-unfriendly, it's like too bright or too loud or whatever. It's hard to sneak through for the player. One thing you can do is you can add some more environmental advantages, although that is kind of the approach that I just said is probably not a good idea. Another one is, if this room has to be stealth-unfriendly, then you can just not put guards there. Like, it can be a place that doesn't have stealth gameplay. Or more importantly, you can recognize its impact on the player experience. Like, we do this deliberately a lot, in stealth games where we're like, ooh, this is the front gate where the player's not supposed to go through. So it's bright, and there's searchlights, and there's a little army of guards, and there's lots of alarms and stuff. And the player can see that and be like, maybe I should find the alternate way in. So you can also use it as a tool overall to your advantage. But it's kind of more interesting to do a micro application of the stealth-friendly and unfriendly principle. So I'm going to come back to this example and analyze it in more depth. So first thing we do is we take out the guard, because as we said, it applies only to the environment. And the next thing we do is we note the stealth-friendly areas. So clearly the dark areas are stealth-friendly areas. This one's kind of an interesting example, which started off by accident. Like, I forgot to draw the shadows in over here to justify why this is stealth-friendly. So for now, let's imagine that there's shadows here, but I'm actually going to come back to this and talk about it, because it's kind of cool. Okay, so those are the advantages, and then we note the the stealth-unfriendly portions of this level. And everything else is a term we call stealth-ambiguous, just to mean, like, does not have one or the other term applying to it. So the thing you can do with this breakdown is you can figure out what the player's going to do, and you can predict their path. So it's kind of like electrical charges. Players are drawn into stealth-friendly areas, and they'll stay there for a while. And they're repelled from stealth-friendly portions of your environment, and they'll try to keep as far away from them as possible, and everything else kind of doesn't have a charge. So in this case, this is how you would predict the player path. And our sort of on-the-ground psychology, intuitive analysis earlier conforms with this, which is cool. So I guess this would be a good time to go back into this example. So this is actually a blind corner, the way it's drawn right now, and so therefore the charge would be a negative. It'd be a stealth-unfriendly aspect of the environment. But one thing I didn't talk about much in this lecture, but I'm going to now anyway, is the fact that the player has this imperative, goal to just keep going. Like, usually what you're doing in levels like this is you got to get to the next room. So despite the fact that would be a negative charge, the player knows that eventually they have to go through it. And so the actually expected behavior would be like players would come up to that negative charge and they really wouldn't want to go through it, but then eventually they would. And in fact, that's from my experience, is what would happen if players were playing a level like this. So we have these tools that we can apply on a micro basis to an encounter and sort of predict the player's path. And then once we have that, we can sort of overlay it with a guard data and start making predictions or determinations about how well balanced our level is. One, quick way to say this is that players will move from island to island to stealth-friendly areas. If you sort of think about like this metaphor where players are on the island of stealth-friendly, they're in the pool of shadow, or they're in the bush which hides them, and they kind of see their next island they want to get to, but there's these stealth-unfriendly things. There's like torches or whatever they might be, and they really don't want to be at them, and so they like set sail and they go, and then they look out for the stealth-unfriendly thing, and then they wind up on the next island and they kind of sit there for a while. And this is really how players behave in stealth games. So the big topic I want to get to is how do we use these tools to support the zero failure goal that we talked about earlier. So the two tools we've already covered is stealth-friendly and unfriendly, predicting the player path. We're going to go through some more examples of those. And the one we're going to introduce is enemy placement. And I want to change domains a little bit away from Thief into a theoretical game that takes place in the woods. So you're sneaking around the woods. Instead of shadows, you've got bushes. Instead of other types of hardcover, you've got trees that you can hide behind. And instead of like metal plates or whatever that you walk over and make noise, we're going to have water, which when you're walking through it makes noise. So it's kind of a cosmetic domain mapping, but just to be fair. So let's take a look at this woods encounter where the player's trying to get from the bottom to the right side of the screen. And we're trying to support zero player failure. So the first thing we do is that stealth-friendly and unfriendly analysis. And what it looks like is that we've got a couple of stealth-friendly areas the player wants to go to, is going to be attracted to. A couple of stealth-unfriendly areas the player is going to be repelled from. And this is the path we're we're looking for. I took out the ambiguous areas because it's not that interesting of a observation really, and it sort of clutters the diagrams. So no more zeros from now on. Okay, so this is the expected player path. It's got that same thing I just talked about, where like despite the fact that the players are repelled away from the end, they will eventually cross it because they know they have to, but they're going to be wary and hesitant to do so, which sometimes is what you want. Anyway, one of the observations I would make about this diagram is it doesn't really solve the blind corner problem. The blind corner problem is, how can the player see what's coming up next before they have to encounter it, right? How do they know what danger they're about to get into, which is super important when you fail so quickly in stealth games. And in this case, like the player got a little bit of range away from that blind corner, but probably not enough that if there was a guard in that area, they wouldn't get caught. So it doesn't quite work. But if we take that bush and we move it down onto that blind corner, we've effectively, clobbered the blind corner with a stealth-friendly area. This is a place where now the player can hang out on that corner, is drawn to that, and from there they can see the entire next experience and start evaluating it, which is cool. And I call these things scouting locations, and I give them an extra big wrench because I think they're probably one of the most important things of this lecture. And if I played a bunch of stealth games next year and they all had scouting locations, I would be much happier. So, the definition of a scouting location is a place where the player can observe the upcoming challenges from a position of safety. So this kind of brings us into the topic of player psychology, like what is going through the player's head as they play levels. And I would love to, or if not me, better yet have somebody else give a really big lecture about player psychology and level building. Don't have time for a lot of that, but I'm going to touch on the parts that I think are most important to this lecture. So, essentially what's going on is you're trying to, like when you think about how players play levels, a lot of times you kind of like playing them in your head, like I was talking about earlier, like, imagine I was playing this level, what would I do? I'm standing here, what do I do? But that's like really dangerous thinking. There's no way for you to have the lack of bias about, to ignore the knowledge you have about what's coming up. There's no way for you to put that uncertainty in your own head and imagine yourself as a player. So, you always have this pitfall of thinking like yourself. The metaphor I like to use is like, imagine you're trying to back out of a parking spot and there's like, you're being flanked by huge pickup trucks and SUVs or whatever. Like you don't know what's out there, but you still have to go, right? So you're backing up and if a car comes, you get hit and it sucks. But scouting locations can help solve that problem. So taking a look at the definition I gave, I said that players can observe upcoming challenges from a position of safety. Well, if it's safety, like one of the things that we've been associating with safety for players is these stealth-friendly locations. So that's a good observation. And in terms of observe, what I mean there is like, like they can see stuff. So there has to be good sight lines. There has to be things we're seeing potentially from here. So a couple of good examples are like if there's a crossroads or, like an alcove that has a good sight line on the next room or whatever, or that blind corner we saw, those are good places to put scouting locations. Or, that's where they exist, I guess I should say. Or, balconies, rafters, hills, any place where the player can be above where the enemies don't tend to look up and see them and they can kind of look down and get an idea of what's down there. What do players do with scouting locations? Well, they learn about the existence of challenges. Like, again, they don't know if that car is going to hit them as they're backing out of the spot or not. They get to look to see, is there guards in this next room or not? They get to see what the guards are doing. Are they patrolling? Are they standing still? Where are they looking? They also get to form and execute plans. If you've got the kind of game, well, in fact, all stealth games, I think, to some degree, are the types of games where players have to stop and think about the upcoming area and what they're going to do. And scouting locations are a place where they can do that. And they're also good for relaxing, which we're going to come back to. So one good trick you can use is turning blind corners into scouting locations. Pretty much, I'm not sure if this is totally true, but my sense is like almost any blind corner, which starts off as this environmental challenge, can be turned into a scouting location by putting soft cover there, essentially. And that really gives the player, again, the ability to check out what's going on, as opposed to screwing them over by, having enemies jump out at them. So I'm going to digress a bit into this other topic. It's a digression on a digression. And this is about like, hey, what would a stealth unfriendly scouting area mean? Which sounds crazy, but I've done it in levels I've built and it sucked. Players don't use stealth unfriendly scouting locations. If there's a balcony, like this is one that I screwed up on. If there's a balcony that is a great place to stop and look out and be like, oh, there's that dude on patrol and this guy and there's the loud flooring there and I'm going to make my plan. But the balcony is totally bright. It doesn't really matter how useful it is. Players just won't go there in the first place. They're repelled by it, as we saw. And so it kind of brings me to the concept of perceived affordance. This guy, Donald Norman, wrote the book Design of Everyday Things. Who here's already read this book? Or parts of it? I've read parts of it. Yeah, good book. And can't really get into it in too much depth, but like affordance essentially means like, what does this thing do? Objects have affordance. So scouting locations afford the ability to, observe the upcoming danger. perceived affordance is like, does it actually look like it does that? So, on the second point down here, does the scouting location draw the player in? If it's brightly lit, it doesn't look like a place where you can observe things safely. Even if you the designer, know you can be safe up there and observe things, if it doesn't look it, then players aren't going to go there. And similarly, like another example would be, does this area look to be as stealth unfriendly as you, the designer, know it to be? So, if you put like loud tile flooring in some room because you're like, this is going to be a really dangerous place for the player to walk, but it's dark, the player's going to look at that and they're not going to see the tile flooring. They're going to see darkness. They're going to think, hey, that's safe. Walk in, make noise, get caught. So perceived affordance, in short, is about make things look the way they're supposed to. Coming back to our example. So we just moved that bush from up there to down there to turn the blind corner into the scouting location, and the next thing we do is we determine the player path. So the player is drawn into the scouting location. From there, they will be drawn to the tree that they can hide behind, and then from there, they're going to force their way through the loud water and out the level. So now that we've got that path, we start thinking about enemy placement. Like, where are we going to put these enemies, and what are they going to be doing? So this is another big topic of the lecture, and one of the things we can do with the stealth friendly and friendly metric, again, is to determine enemy placement. In a stealth game, enemy power is relative to their environment. Like, in a combat game, it doesn't matter where you put, the giant robot, he's going to be as powerful that might not. Okay, I'm going to clarify myself. The other monster, it doesn't matter where you put him, he's going to be as powerful there as he is anywhere else. He's still going to be able to do the same amount of damage. He's still going to be able, to have as many hit points, take as long to kill, whatever. But a stealth game, that's not true. Like, just one little enemy in, a stealth unfriendly environment can lead the player to failure as quickly, or more quickly than 3 or 4 enemies in a very stealth friendly environment. So it's kind of a question of like, what territory does the guard control? So let's take this example where there's a room with shadowy corners and a shadowy entrance, and there's a guard who, every so often he switches which way he's facing from towards the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. So when he's facing up, what we're looking at now is his sight cone is line of sight kind of stuff. And when he's facing up, the stuff that's horizontal lines, that's what I describe as his territory. Basically, what you're doing is you're flood filling his entire sight cone into the world in places where there's not soft cover. So when he's facing down, you're flood filling the sight cone down, and as you can see, his territory doesn't extend into the dark corners because he can't see you there. So that's not his, that's the player's territory. And so you can kind of overlay this data with your player path data and prove to yourself that there is a zero failure path. Like, hey, when he's facing that way, the player can go from the dark entrance to the dark corner to the other dark corner, and then when he turns around, the player can leave. So I want to talk a little bit about enemy behaviors as design tools, because they're not environmental tools. Static enemies, so there's kind of two ones. There's static enemies and there's dynamic enemies. Like, they might be patrolling, they might be changing direction, whatever. Static enemies control a fixed territory. Like, they're always facing the same way. That's their territory. Whatever they can see from there, whatever flood fills out from their view cone. Versus patrolling guys who cover more territory overall because, they're moving around, but they don't control it all the time. So they provide these windows of opportunity. So they're both a little mixed. You use them depending on where your situation is, what you're trying to achieve. Conversely, there's unpredictable behavior. And I give this one a double negative wrench. Because it's sort of a design tool, because you can kind of use it to do things that, do things deliberately. But most of the things you can do deliberately with this is screw the player over. So presumably you don't always want to do that, or you never want to do that. And so therefore it's kind of a design tool, but I'm going to say it's like borderline designer pitfall that you're trying to avoid. So unpredictable behavior, like the player doesn't know what territory the guards control when. Like at one moment they're controlling over here, then suddenly they do something you didn't expect and they're looking at you and you're screwed. So this includes like really long patrol paths. Like in one level I made, there was this huge building, and I thought it'd be a really good idea for realism, aesthetic reasons, interest, emergence, to have these guys like on this huge patrol path all the way on the outside of the building, which took about 20 minutes in game time. So basically, from the player's point of view, they would just show up. The player had no way to know they were coming. And similarly, like branching patrols, which also seemed like a cool idea. The guy will come, and then he comes to a branch in the hallway or whatever, and he's like, rolls the dice, chooses right or left. But from a player point of view, you could be watching that and be like, look, he took right 3 times in a row. Great, I know what to do. Then you move, he takes a left, you get screwed. That's no good. And scripted behavior often leads to this too. Like, you're walking down the hallway, 2 guys are in conversation. You're like, that's interesting. But it's a scripted conversation. They get done, they start their patrol pass. They're, again, suddenly facing you, you're caught. So unpredictable behavior, I would claim, is not as good as predictable, static, or dynamic behavior. Okay, so we're back to this example again. The player is going to move from that bush to the tree to the water. And what you want to do is have enemy behavior that provides opportunities at each leg of that journey where the player is not inside the enemy's territory. So you got an idea about the enemy's territory is over time, and you know where the player is going to move over time, and you want to make sure that there's always, for every leg of the journey, those things don't intersect. So I can't think of a single place in this diagram where you could put a static guard who would seem like believably guarding this area, who would fulfill this fantasy of a well-guarded area that you're trying to achieve. That would actually let the player sneak through. So I claim that you have to do a patrol route. You know, you could have the guy like facing the wall, but then the player's not going to feel like they have to be stealthy if there's the guard who faces the wall all day. So here's the patrol path I came up with. One of the nice things about this one is it does fulfill the fantasy really well. Like, it kind of looks like this guy is trying to control this area and, you know, make sure nobody gets by. But the nice thing is it also provides those opportunities for the player to get by. So I accidentally slipped in the minus sign down here, but that was a Photoshop mistake, meaning user mistake in Photoshop. So ignore it. Okay, great. So here's how the player does it. So they can sneak up into that scouting location bush, no problem. When the guy is facing that way, he controls that territory. They can sneak up to behind the tree. And when the guy faces the other way, he controls that territory. They can sneak off over the water. The water is important, right, because it makes sound. So territories in terms of sound, too, sometimes. Like if maybe this is the range at which he can hear the player walking through this water. So again, you can confirm that the player's outside that range. You know, they're not in his territory when they have to do that action. So I'm going to digress for a second into open-endedness. So a lot of the examples so far are really about predicting the player path to the point where it sounds like there's just one. Like, you know, as a level builder, you know exactly what the player is going to do from the start to end of their experience. And obviously, if you know much about the games I've worked on, I'm a big proponent of giving the player more options and choice and expression. So how do you do that? And this diagram kind of summarizes how you do that, which is you put in more stealth-friendly areas, and the player suddenly has more options via the permutations of them. But it's a little more sophisticated than that, so we're going to go back to this example to see how it's done. So here's the example where we have 3 stealth-friendly areas, one stealth-unfriendly area, or advantages, challenges, however you want to think of it. So first thing I'm going to do is add some more. Threw in another stealth alcove, threw in some more connectivity in a dark scouting spotty kind of corner thing. And one of the things is this gives you a license to add some more challenges, so I'm going to throw on a metal plate and another torch. And suddenly if you do the path analysis and you connect all of your stealth-friendly spots together, you can kind of see these different paths. And, because there's multiple ones that branch, it kind of implies that the player has different options about how to proceed through. There isn't just one straight up, this is the right way to do it. Other ways are, less optimal. And this is, in fact, I think, for this level, I would claim this is pretty true. If you built this in Thief, players would kind of play this way. And then, again, you can overlay your guard data and start thinking about, is it fair? Is there opportunities for the player to get through? So, in short, the way I think that is good to make open-ended, it sounds a little careless, but, just kind of throw on tons of challenges and advantages into the level and see what happens. Don't author an experience, just create a playground. And then afterwards, you use these tools to sort of figure out which paths exist and balance them out. So when we talk about player path, I've been sort of assuming that the player is just trying to sneak through the level, but there's other stuff that they do besides sneak past enemies. They might sneak up behind enemies to pick their pockets or strangle them or whatever. Sneak up to treasure or objective items to steal them. Sneak up to use their tools, like maybe they have wire clippers to get through a fence or whatever. Again, with respect to this lecture, it's all kind of the same, but I'm going to talk about balancing risk and reward next, and let's assume that the player is sneaking up on this guard to knock him out. So on the left example, we have the player who's in a bush and has to come out quickly at just the right time when the guard turns back on his patrol so they can get up to him close enough to knock him out or whatever. Versus on the other side, it's not so much about timing as it is about making sure you move really slowly through the water to cover a shorter amount of distance, because if you go fast, the guard will hear you. So this is a common design skill. I'm sure you guys all know about balancing risk and reward, but it's part of it. And in fact, when you have open-endedness, there's lots of player paths. Unless you balance them pretty well, you're not really creating a choice. If it's like, hey, would you like to do the easy good thing or the sucky hard thing? It's not really a choice for the player, so balancing it's important. So how do you tune player paths? First of all, you figure out what they are. Secondly, you compare them to enemy placement. Thirdly, you confirm that there's at least one zero failure path through this encounter, and then you balance your paths for risk and reward. So that's what we've talked about already. One quick rule of thumb that I find works really well is just to create this rhythm of stealth-friendly and unfriendly areas. Like you sort of, if you have anything that's really consistently stealth-friendly or unfriendly, just like break it up with little spots and islands of the opposite. And it works a little bit better when everything's a little bit stealth-unfriendly, and you break it up with little islands of stealth-friendly because it has that island hopping behavior I talked about earlier. In general, this kind of thing is going to create a cycle of tension and relaxation, which is really important in stealth games. Like, stealth games are very tense. You're always, like, nervous you're going to get caught because of that low threshold for failure. Excuse me. And so, like, these areas let you, like, chill out. We talked about scouting areas earlier as a place to relax. And, again, it could put you on this nice cycle of, like, oh, it's really tense. Oh, I got to the scouting area. I can chill out. Oh, it's really tense. I'm going to get caught. Oh, I didn't get caught. And you can chill back out, which is kind of a nicer balance. So there's a couple different approaches to using these tools. You can know ahead of time what sort of path you want the player to have through the level, and you can place tools that's going to encourage that path. You can figure out, you can just build a level like, hey, I want to build a bank, and I want it to be cool and beautiful and high performance, and then afterwards figure out what's already present. Like, you're putting in environmental, tools into that level, what paths emerge, and then tune those. Or you can kind of use the rule of thumb and make that rhythm I was talking about. So the last topic is the phases of stealth gameplay. Basically, there's 4 phases, and we've been talking about this one as the assumption. That's where, like, the player is sneaking through a room, there's enemies present, but they haven't seen the player yet. They're not looking for the player or anything. They have no idea he's there. But there's, in most stealth games, a few others. The first is when you're sneaking around, but there's nobody there. There's no enemies present at all. Maybe you're not sneaking. The third is when the enemies are searching for you. Again, in a game like Zelda, this phase doesn't exist because searching equals playing one animation. But in a game like Thief or some of the other games that I listed earlier, there's a sort of a searching phase. And then lastly, there's the, hey, you've been caught phase. So the reason that you care about these is because your level design has to support not just the phase we've already been talking about, but you need kind of like phase-specific aspects of your level to support the different like goals and needs that the player has for each. And this is going to add more constraints to your environment. This is like another thing you have to support, and if you have an art staff who's trying to deal with this, they learn to hate you. And it requires a little bit more thinking about the player psychology. What is the player thinking, feeling, wanting now? So I'm going to cover the other 3 phases super quickly. The one where there's no enemies present, the most important thing to think about here is like, well, does the player know that? Like if you have radar or a HUD or something, like maybe the player just does know there's no enemies and they can like run quickly to the next area. But if they don't have a HUD or radar or something, they might not know. They might be nervous and they might still be sneaking. There's a good example from Thief again, where you had this beautiful bank lobby that we wanted the player to go through because, hey, don't worry about it. There's nobody over there. Just walk through. But they just wouldn't. They'd stand and they'd look and they'd be like, shit, I have to get all the way over there, and there's tile and there's lights and holy shit. And like, so that was bad perceived affordance, right? It didn't look like a place that you could sneak through easily, but it was because there's no enemies present. So the relevant design tools I would suggest here are scouting locations that we've already talked about, because the player can like get into them and spend some time relaxing and looking at the upcoming challenges. Or, you can just treat every aspect of your level as though we're in the phase we've been using as default. Like, you're never going to put enemies there, but make it look like a good place to sneak through. The player will feel more comfortable. The third phase is when you're being searched for. So you made a noise, he caught sight of you, whatever, he's coming to find you. So when in this phase, the player really wants to find some way to get away. The guard is searching for him. He hasn't totally found the player yet, but he's getting closer and closer. The player wants to get further away so they're not going to get detected. This is a higher-paced gameplay. It's not controlled by the player. It's controlled by the guard. Wherever the guard is coming from, the player has to move in the opposite direction, loosely speaking. So your question is, like, does your environment support this? So environmental tools that do support this, one is connectivity. I mean connectivity in the really physical sense, like the deathmatch level sense of, like, what corridors exist and how they connect to each other. And the antithesis is dead ends, which is another one that got the dreaded 2 negative wrench. Basically, like, if the guard is searching for the player's trying to move away and they get flushed into a dead end, they're screwed. But if there's some connectivity there where they can go somewhere else, that's good. Similarly, connected islands is stealth-friendly. That's just, instead of physical connectivity, that's a different type of connectivity. These are connected areas where the player knows they can move away without having to expose themselves to the guard. And a couple of things that like work against the player in this situation. Loud surfaces are often challenges you want in your level on purpose, but they make it really hard because the player is just moving away and they step on something, and the guard who's looking and searching in the other direction suddenly has more information about where the player is. And obstructions are bad because, like furniture or whatever, they can make noise. But more importantly, like, you're trying to get away and this thing's in your way. There's a dynamic tool that I want to talk about called Ring Around the Rosie, which is a guard searching for you. And this is when like you're playing a stealth game, a guard's searching for you, and there's some big like column or something, and you keep ring around the rosy, you keep like moving with this thing in between you, and this happens a lot in a lot of stealth games that I've seen, and you can actually create this in your levels by setting up situations like this where there are big columns or something with like kind of a lot of space around them, at least some of which is stealth friendly space. And the last section, last phase of gameplay I talked about was getting caught. So in terms of combat, like there's plenty of places where you can talk about how to build good combat levels. But I want to talk about fleeing, which I think is a little bit more unique to stealth games when they even bother to have that phase of gameplay. So when the player is fleeing, what they want to do is just get away from the guy who's chasing them. Like there's no more stealth anymore. You're just trying to run. And what you really want to do is get away to a point where you can reset the experience. Like hide somewhere, the guards don't know you're there, and depending on how realistically or badly you model AI intelligence, they go back to their patrols or whatever. So does your environment support these player goals? So again, connectivity and dead ends are on opposite poles of this. If the player has a place to run, great. And if they run into a dead end, they're screwed. Obstructions, similarly, are the same. The couple of new environmental advantages I would suggest are places where your enemy can't follow. So balconies are really cool because the player can make daring escapes by jumping off the balcony, and the guards can shake their fist and wish they could get down there, but they can't, or they have to go the long way around or whatever. Perhaps a bad example of this would be like ladders that your AI can't climb, or some sort of pathing ability your AI doesn't have, because you're really just going to be showcasing your AI limitations. So it's kind of a trade-off there. And reset areas are places where the player can hide and be pretty comfortable that the AI is not going to get there. And often those are scouting locations. So I just want to give another thumbs up to scouting locations, because amongst the other things they can do, they support that cycle of tension and relaxation. They help the player formulate plans, learn about upcoming challenges, and they also help them reset the experience if they have to flee. A dynamic tool that sometimes comes up when the player is fleeing is this out of the frying pan into the fire effect, which is when the guard is chasing, you're trying to sneak through a room, you got caught, the guard's chasing you, and you wind up getting flushed into the next upcoming stealth encounter before, you weren't supposed to run into this room screaming, you were supposed to be sneaking through it, so suddenly you have all these other guards on your tail. This is a pretty hard one to solve in level building if this is a dynamic that occurs in your game, but the one thing I might suggest is if you had a little ring around the rosy connectivity action in this hallway right here, the player could at least double back and go back into the previous room so they don't screw up the upcoming one. But it's a tough one. So here's the summary. Level building for stealth is problematic because there's a very low threshold for failure. The player can go from like no failure to full failure pretty quickly. And so your goal is to create zero failure paths that the player can figure out but aren't too obvious. Part of what you need to do is be able to look at your level design and predict what path the player is going to have. One of the tools for doing that is the stealth-friendly, stealth-unfriendly thing that we talked about. You can also use that to tune player paths with environmental tools and think about both enemy placement and territory. You sort of overlay those two sets of data and confirm that there is a zero failure path. You got to think about phases of gameplay, too, depending on what your game is like, what phases exist in your game. And player psychology is a big part of this, as we saw. And that's it. Thanks. So, thank you. So we got 7 minutes for questions if anybody has any. Yes?
There's kind of a sort of a backlash against stealth in some games, partly because I think it's crammed into games where it doesn't necessarily fit, but also I think part of it is these tools that you've described, we've seen so often now. I mean, they're almost a cliche. They're certainly effective. But have you seen any games recently where they're sort of breaking or bending the rules that you're talking about effectively?
Okay, so the question was, there's a political backlash against stealth in games, in part because a lot of the tools I describe are pretty cliche. And so are there games that sort of break away from the cliche? Stealth games. Does anyone here want to answer that question for me? I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'm trying to think of what stealth games I played recently. I feel like sort of like when the genre was beginning, there's a little bit more diversity. Like Commandos is kind of an interesting game. One of the things that was in my slides earlier was, does anyone play Commandos? It's like top-down, 2D, sneaking kind of puzzly game. I think there's a sequel coming out soon. It was a really good game. It's a stealth game. So you're trying to sneak around these little guys through territory, and there's guards with patrol pass. And one of the interesting tools they put in was this tool where you could explicitly see the guards' view cones. So as they move, there's like this little triangle which represents their view cones. And the tool they gave you is this marker you drop in the world. And when the view cone sweeps through it, it picks up, you can't see them until this marker is seen by a guard, in which case it kind of he picks it up and then he can see his view cone. The interesting thing about the tool wasn't that obvious application, is that you could like drop it anywhere in the level and then go do your business somewhere else and then come back and if it was still there, you knew that was a permanently safe place, basically. It was a sample point tester for, like the eyedropper tool for guard territory. So that's kind of an interesting example, I think. But that was a long time ago.
Just to follow up, do you think that there needs to be any sort of rules?
Does there need to be innovative? The question was, does there need to be rule bending? Do I think the genre is stale? I play a lot of stealth games, but I play them for like 5 minutes because I get really frustrated. There's games that do it well, and there's games that do it poorly, and I feel like I don't know. I'm going to give you an I don't know, but maybe let's talk about it after. Okay, other questions? Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear. Can you speak up a little?
When you have the areas where the player hesitates before crossing,
Yep.
do you recommend, what do you classify as time pressure mechanisms?
Sure. The question was like those areas that the players are hesitant to cross but have to, how do you get the player to cross them? And time pressure in particular. Time pressure is a great one. There's always implicit, well, there's not always, but there's generally, for most players, a sense of implicit time pressure. Like, yeah, I got to get to the next space. And you can give, a countdown clock that works. If you're going to do that time pressure on that, like very strict mechanical level, then you really have to design your game around that aesthetic. You have to support, your mechanics and dynamics have to support that sort of fast-paced gameplay. Thief does not. Thief is a very, move slowly kind of a game. So, other questions? This side of the room? Back to this side. Okay, in the back. 4 more minutes.
Metal Gear Solid rehash coming out with like a new camera
Uh-huh.
perspective, and those advertisements kind of changed the gameplay. And I was wondering how you felt like a third-person camera can affect like the advantages or disadvantages. What do you think about that as a tool?
Well, let me tell you. So when we're working on Thief Deadly Shadows, in the middle, we went from being a strictly first-person game to a both first and third-person game. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that. So the question is, a new camera mode. Are you talking just third-person in particular, or?
Yeah, I mean, in general.
Are you talking about third-person, or are you talking about some crazy new third-person camera?
Nothing new, just
Okay.
how to manipulate the camera views that the player has.
Right. Okay. So the question is, a third-person cameras and stealth and being able to manipulate a third-person camera. That's kind of a game mechanics question more so than a game systems question more so than a content question. So I'm not going to get into it too deeply. I think the short version is hey, it gives you more spatial awareness, which is good because in first-person games it's really hard to get spatial and context awareness. But it might, it gives you more than you would have realistically, so that's like a trade-off. You can see around corners without exposing yourself, which is cool, but then players feel like it's not them being stealthy, it's the camera. Questions? Yeah.
I was looking at the Cox game, but you typically try and always bookend them with safe cover. So I know sides at the end, you necessarily have
Right. So the question is, for a given encounter, I kept drawing my encounters as this encounter and then a little pipe that connects to the next one. The question was do you tend to bookend those, the edges, the edges of the stealth encounter with stealth friendly areas? And the answer is yes. That's an excellent technique for a game like Thief. So once you're through, it's again tension and relaxation. It's tense, you got to solve the stealth problem, and then when you get to the other end, you can relax and then go and sort of scout out the next one. Question over there.
Yeah, I was wondering, it's a tough one, but do you have any ideas on how to solve the unrealistic behavior of guards going back to their location where they should still be looking for you since they know you're not supposed to be there. Also, you've been in the safe spot.
Okay, the question is, how do you solve the fantasy versus game balance problem that comes up in stealth games where you get caught, the guards chase you, but then you get away, and now they're just supposed to go back on patrol? What is a better solution? Because that one is not very realistic. Again, that's kind of a game system question. It's really hard. You can sort of imagine fiction solutions, which I'm not imagining really quickly right now. But maybe the player has a device that convinces the guards they're gone or left or dead. Might be one. Another one is I actually think there's valid stealth games that don't let you have anything but stealth gameplay. If you get caught, then you have to reload basically. There isn't a chasing, fleeing, fighting phase of the game, which is cool because it keeps the player invested in the stealth part. Question? the player can flee from the guards. How do you keep them from just sprinting through the level? You can do that with environmental tools, and I think a lot of those environmental tools are not stealth level specific. Like there's different configurations of hallways or obstacles which inherently slow the player down a little bit. Okay, that was the last question. So if you have other ones, please come up. Thank you very much for attending. And this is the catalog that we developed during the lecture.